Fellas, today we're going to be taking a look at UFC fights that you've probably forgot happened. These are the fights between like two massive stars that have taken place that most people have just completely forgotten about, or they never knew it happened in the first place. And we're going to be taking a look at some examples today. Before I get into it, please let me know if you know any of these fights, or if you have actually forgotten, or you never even knew they existed, or if I missed any other fights out that are quite similar to this. So between two stars that took place that no one really remembers. Please leave a like, and we're going to go in there with the first one, which for me is Anderson Silva versus Daniel Cormier. Now, this is the first fight for me on the list. This was such a forgotten about fight, and the only reason I really remember this fight, and it's not because of the fight itself, it's not because of the two huge stars in the fight, in the event, it's because of the yellow octagon. I don't know what Dana White and Hunter were thinking when they decided to select a yellow octagon, but it was horrible. It made that I don't even want to watch this fight because of the yellow octagon. It looked terrible. Some people like it, and fair to them, but I absolutely hate it. It looked terrible. But the fight itself, it was DC dominating. I don't think it wasn't for a title. This fight wasn't for a title, which is surprising because you've got Anderson Silva, who's the greatest middleweight of all time, besides Sean Strickland, and then you've got Daniel Cormier, who's one of the best light heavyweights of all time. So when these two fight, you kind of expect it to be for a belt, but it wasn't for a belt. I think it might have been a weight issue or a last-minute replacement for DC. I'm not too sure exactly what it was, but it wasn't for a title. But the fight itself, it was just DC wrestling and dominating the entire fight, using his grappling to dominate pretty much the entire fight. Silva didn't really have a response for this, and to be fair, Silva hasn't really been the same since this fight. And this was not Silva's prime, by the way. This was 2016. This was kind of like the rise of Daniel Cormier, but it definitely wasn't Silva's prime. He's kind of started to fall off after this fight, I'm going to be honest. But yeah, it was a pretty dominating fight for DC. There was a couple of moments when Anderson Silva had success on the feet, but yeah, not a lot of people remember that these two massive stars actually fought each other, when in reality they did. So that's one fight that I'm going to select between two fighters that most people forgot about. Next up, we have Kamaru Usman versus Sean Strickland. Now, after UFC 293, I feel like a lot more people kind of remembering this fight, because obviously people pay attention to Sean Strickland and his background and things. So I feel like a lot more people are getting aware of this fight. But yeah, Kamaru Usman isn't the only African that Sean Strickland has faced, and maybe Adesanya's Chinese, the Chinese champion, but whatever. He has also faced Kamaru Usman before, and it was a pretty dominating fight by Kamaru Usman, to be fair. It happened back in 2017, so it happened quite a while ago. But yeah, it was domination by Kamaru Usman. On the feet, he was winning, which is crazy because nowadays there's no way that Kamaru Usman's beating Sean Strickland on the feet. But back in 2017, that did happen. Usman beat him on the feet, and obviously in the grappling side of things, he won as well. This was before the Chad Sean Strickland that we know nowadays. This was kind of like when Strickland wasn't really known. He wasn't really the greatest fighter. And it's crazy because since this fight, they've both gone on to become champions, which is good. Obviously, Strickland wasn't the champion in this division, though. And one thing I want to clarify about this video is it's going to be a lot of, how do you say it? There's going to be a lot of, there's going to be a theme that fighters that are fighting in an unnatural weight class usually tend to lose. We've just had Anderson Silva fighting the light heavyweight division, which is in his unnatural weight class. And now we've got Strickland at welterweight, which is his unnatural weight class. So that's what I mean by that. And yeah, it was a dominating fight by Kamaru Usman, pretty dominating for him. And this was one of his few victims that he then went to go on and fight. And at this point, he was undefeated in the UFC. I mean, the only person he's ever lost to in the UFC is obviously Leon Edwards. But yeah, this was a dominating fight for Kamaru Usman. Fair play to Strickland for giving it a go, but it just wasn't his time. This was Kamaru Usman's come-up era. This was when Kamaru Usman was approaching his prime. I'd say Usman's prime was around 2021, 2020-ish, but yeah, this is a fight that not a lot of people remember, so I'm going to bring it out. And next up, we have Dustin Poirier versus the Korean Zombie. Now, what's wild about this fight is that they fought each other back in 2012, and even this year, they're both on the top of their game. Dustin Poirier just main evented UFC 291, and Korean Zombie just main evented Holloway versus Zombie. Zombie has now retired, but they actually fought each other back at featherweight ages ago in 2012. And it was actually a dominating fight by Korean Zombie, and it ended pretty quickly. It ended within, like, I think it was 1 minute and 20 seconds or something like that. I don't know the exact time, but it ended in just over a minute, and it was Korean Zombie submitted him. Now, this was when Poirier, I like to call him P-head Poirier, because it was when he was, it was when he was at featherweight. He was bald, and he wasn't very good. I mean, he wasn't terrible, but he wasn't very good at featherweight, so making the, you know, the move to lightweight was the correct decision. And again, another example of a fighter being at an unnatural weight class, but this was prime Korean Zombie. This was when Korean Zombie was around his prime, and he just absolutely dismantled Dustin Poirier, which again is crazy to think nowadays, because they're both on the top of their game. Well, maybe not at the top of their game. I mean, Poirier's just been knocked out and Korean Zombie's retired after being knocked out as well. So they've both got KO'd in their last fights. But regardless, you know what I'm trying to say. They're both high-level fighters still in 2023. And they both fought for a title shot, I believe, in 2022. Or maybe it was Poirier's title shot against Oliveira 2021. I don't remember, but I think it was. But no, okay, Korean Zombie fought for the belt in 2022 and Poirier fought for the belt in 2021, I think. But either way, no one really remembers this fight because, I mean, why would they? Korean Zombie and Poirier? But it did happen, and it was a dominating fight for Poirier. So, not for Poirier, for Korean Zombie. But, yeah, dominating fight for Zombie. No one really remembers this fight. So, listen, if you've only just found out about this fight, I mean, that's fair enough. But anyway, next up, the next fight we have is, I'm going to say it's a fairly recent fight. And the one thing about this fight that makes it unique is this could actually happen again pretty soon. Well, not pretty soon, but I can definitely see this happening again, and it's Leon Edwards versus Vincente Luque. I've heard a lot of people saying, well, in the MMA community, that Leon Edwards should take on Vincente Luque. You know, that's a fantasy matchup. Vincente Luque could be the guy to beat Leon Edwards, and they have fought before. They fought before, back in 2017. But neither of them were really known, which is why this fight wasn't you know, a known fight. But Vincente Luque is on Leon Edwards' resume. Not a lot of people know that. They think the only person on Leon Edwards' resume is Kamaru, Usman, and, I don't know, Nate Diaz. But Vincente Luque is also on it, and Leon Edwards is basically fought into a decision. It was a decent fight by Leon Edwards. Pretty interesting fight if you watch it back. And that's what I mean about the rematch. I can definitely see these guys rematching again, because obviously Vincente Luque is just coming off a win against Rafael dos Anjos, and Leon Edwards is the champion. So, like, even if Leon Edwards was to lose his belt, let's say Covington was to beat him and Vincente Luque was to win his next fight, I can definitely see them booking a rematch between the two of them. But yeah, this fight happened back in 2017 and not a lot of people know about it. Not a lot of people know that this fight has already happened. Like I said, neither of them were really known. They weren't. This was for a fight night, and they weren't even the main event. No one really knew who they were at the time. They weren't huge stars like they were today. So it kind of just went under the bus, this fight, but it did happen. And I think if this fight was to happen again, I'd probably go with Leon Edwards again, because Vincente Luque, obviously, he hasn't looked great in his last couple of fights. I'm going to be honest with you. He didn't look the same as he was when he was a killer a couple years ago. But regardless, this fight happened. Not a lot of people remember this fight happening, but it definitely happened. So if you guys know that Leon Edwards took on Vincente Luque, let me know. But next up, we have another fight in the this is the featherweight division again, and it was Conor McGregor versus Max Holloway. This was an interesting fight. This was during the McGregor era. This was, I say the McGregor era because he was a featherweight. McGregor at featherweight was in his prime. This was prime McGregor. And the only thing that separates this matchup is it wasn't necessarily an unnatural weight for Max Holloway, because he's still a featherweight. And I know he's moved to lightweight and fought there, but we all know naturally he's a featherweight. So this fight took place in the featherweight division. And it was a decent fight for McGregor. This was prime McGregor. Took him on pretty quick. Well, dominated him pretty much the entire fight. And Max Holloway, being Max Holloway, couldn't get finished. Obviously, we know that McGregor, back then, McGregor in the featherweight era, he was finishing pretty much everybody. There was very few people to actually not be finished by McGregor in the featherweight era. And Holloway was one of them, but it was domination from McGregor. Whether it was grappling and ground and pound, McGregor was winning. And obviously, on the feet, it was domination to McGregor. And this was when Max Holloway was kind of new to the UFC. He wasn't a big star at the time. It was kind of just another person for McGregor to fight. And interestingly, they didn't really have any beef together either, which is weird, because McGregor in the featherweight era nearly trash talked pretty much everybody. But it's kind of ironic that the one person he didn't trash talk is one of the greatest featherweights of all time in Max Holloway. So, I mean, that doesn't really make sense, actually, because he did trash talk Jose Aldo, and Jose Aldo was one of the best as well. But either way, yeah, McGregor won convincingly. And an interesting fact about this fight is that Max Holloway is actually, in the featherweight division, Max Holloway has gone on to win every single fight after this fight, besides Alexander Volkanovski. So, to everybody who's not named Alexander Volkanovski in the featherweight division, Holloway's not lost a fight since McGregor. I think he's won like 20-something, so that's impressive for McGregor. But for Holloway. But yeah, this was an interesting fight. Again, no one really knew that this fight happened, but obviously if you've been following McGregor's career, you'll know this fight happened, because McGregor hasn't had an extremely long UFC career like some stars have. So if you've been following McGregor's career, you'll know this happened. But there are a lot of people that don't know these two massive stars took each other on. So yeah, I'm going to include that. Next, we have Derek Lewis versus Francis Ngannou. Now, you're going to be wondering, why haven't I heard this fight? Surely this is the most powerful fight, and you're probably thinking it ended in a knockout. It was just a bit of a boring fight. Like, they had a beef at the weigh-ins, and they had scuffles. They didn't really like each other coming into it. And at the time, and even today, I'd argue, they were the hardest hitters in the UFC. You're going to expect, if you put the two hardest hitters in the UFC against each other, you're going to get a knockout regardless. That wasn't the case. It was just a bit of a boring fight. They were both very hesitant to throw because they were aware of each other's power. But Derek Lewis was the more active fighter. He got the more work done, and he ended up winning the fight, which is weird to say that Derek Lewis beat Francis Ngannou when Derek Lewis right now isn't in the greatest career spot. I know he's coming off a win, but he's not in the greatest career spot. And Francis Ngannou is an undefeated champion. Well, I know he's not undefeated in the UFC, but he's undefeated as a champion, which is weird. And now he's gone on to fight Tyson Fury, so it's weird how the world works. But Derek Lewis, yeah, he beat Francis Ngannou. But yeah, it was a very anticlimactic fight. They were both very scared to engage, which is probably why a lot of people haven't heard about this fight. They don't know, never knew it happened. UFC 226, but it did happen. Anticlimactic fight. Not much went on. So yeah, I mean, if they were to rematch, and I said this before, maybe it wouldn't be the case, but I genuinely think if these guys were to fight each other 10 times, they'd both win 5 times. It's so even. I'd probably edge towards Ngannou if this was to happen nowadays, because obviously Derek Lewis has been finished a lot recently. I know he's coming off a win, but he has been finished a lot recently, and Francis Ngannou is probably one of the most dangerous heavyweights in UFC history. I'd probably edge Ngannou if this fight was to happen again, but it's weird. Derek Lewis, he's really weird. He loses to people he should beat and then beats people he should lose to, which is weird. But that's one fight. And finally, the final fight on this list is going to be Wonderboy versus Whittaker. A lot of people forgot about this fight as well. This was ages ago, back in 2014. And again, it was an unnatural weight class for Robert Whittaker. He's normally a middleweight. This was in the welterweight division. And Wonderboy knocked him out in 1 round. Straight up, Wonderboy knocked him out in 1 round, which is weird to say that Whittaker's been knocked out, because I think after this fight, after the Wonderboy fight, Whittaker hasn't lost to anybody in the UFC besides Israel Adesanya and Dricus du Plessis. So kind of like Max Holloway, he's gone on a bit of a streak after this fight. Did Whittaker, and Wonderboy's just Wonderboy, man. He won some, he lost some, but listen, he's one of the best strikers in the UFC. But yeah, this was the welterweight Whittaker era when he wasn't at his best. Obviously, this would be a completely different story if it was to happen nowadays, which is interesting, because I wonder what would happen if these guys fought each other again nowadays. I'm not saying it makes sense as a matchup, but I'm intrigued to know what would happen if we were to match up Wonderboy and Whittaker nowadays. I'd probably edge towards Whittaker because, I mean, he's a middleweight and, you know, he's younger, he's closer to a title than Wonderboy is. But yeah, back in the day, yeah, Wonderboy slept Whittaker. Not a lot of people know about this because they're both big stars in the UFC, both very likeable as well, but no one really brings up the fact that Wonderboy did sleep Whittaker, probably because it was in 2014, and that's kind of irrelevant to nowadays because obviously it doesn't really mean anything. It happened ages ago. But yeah, this was a dominant fight for Wonderboy, and maybe it was a wake-up call for Whittaker to go to middleweight, because like I said, after this fight he won every single fight besides Adesanya and Dricus. So that's another example of a fight that most people have forgotten, and that is my list of UFC fights that you probably forgot happened. Please let me know if you didn't forget about some of these fights, or if you